The 100 Years' War, the war that changed medieval Europe. Imagine a war so long that no single king, soldier, or peasant could live to see all of it. A war that began with a dispute over a crown, but grew into something far greater. A war of kings and dynasties, of knights, castles, longbows, sieges, betrayals, and broken kingdoms. A war that devastated France, exhausted England, and changed the future of medieval Europe. For more than a century, England and France fought over land, power, legitimacy, and identity. But this was not truly one endless battle. It was a long chain of campaigns, truces, invasions, rebellions, and fragile peace agreements. Sometimes the English seemed unstoppable. Sometimes France appeared close to collapse. And yet, by the end, the kingdom that looked defeated would rise again. History remembers this struggle by one dramatic name: the 100 Years' War. It lasted, with interruptions, from 1337 to 1453. And by the time it ended, the world of medieval warfare had changed forever. The mounted knight was no longer the unquestioned master of the battlefield. The longbow had shown its power. Gunpowder and artillery were beginning to reshape war, and stronger monarchies were replacing the older feudal order. But to understand how this massive conflict began, we must first ask one question. Why did the King of England claim the throne of France? The roots of the 100 Years' War go back long before 1337. For centuries, English kings held lands in France. This strange situation began after the Norman conquest of England in 1066, when William, Duke of Normandy, became King of England. From that moment, the kings of England were not only rulers of England, they were also great landholders inside France. And that created a political problem. In England, the English king was a sovereign monarch. But in France, for his French lands, he was technically a vassal of the French king. One man could be a king in one kingdom, and a subordinate noble in another. This was unstable from the beginning. Over time, the kings of France tried to reduce English power on the continent. The English kings tried to defend what remained of their French possessions. By the early 14th century, one of the most important English territories in France was Gascony, in the southwest. But land was only part of the issue. The deeper crisis came in 1328, when the French king, Charles IV, died without a direct male heir. The French nobles chose Philip VI of Valois as king. But Edward III of England also had a claim. Edward's mother, Isabella, was the daughter of a French king. Through her, Edward argued that he had a legitimate right to the French throne. The French rejected this. They argued that the crown of France could not pass through the female line. At first, Edward accepted Philip VI, but the relationship between the two kings quickly deteriorated. In 1337, Philip VI confiscated Edward's lands in Gascony. Edward responded by renewing his claim to the French throne. What had been a feudal dispute became a dynastic war. The 100 Years' War had begun. At the beginning of the war, France seemed far stronger. France had a larger population, greater wealth, and more resources. England was smaller. Its economy was weaker. Its armies were usually smaller. But England had several advantages. English armies were often highly mobile, well organized, and built around a deadly combination: men-at-arms fighting on foot, supported by large numbers of longbowmen. The English longbow was not a magical weapon. It required years of training and discipline. But in the hands of experienced archers, it could fire quickly, at long range, and with devastating effect against horses and exposed soldiers. Edward III used these strengths carefully. Instead of trying to conquer all of France at once, English armies often launched destructive raids known as chevauchées. These raids burned villages, destroyed crops, spread fear, weakened the French economy, and challenged the authority of the French king. The goal was not only to win battles. It was to make the French crown look unable to protect its own people. In 1346, Edward III invaded northern France. The French army caught up with him near the village of Crécy. The French had more men. They had many powerful nobles and knights. They expected victory. But the English chose their position carefully. Their men-at-arms fought on foot. Their archers were placed where they could dominate the battlefield. When the French attacked, they advanced into a storm of arrows. The battle became chaos. French cavalry charges broke apart. Knights crashed into each other. The symbols of aristocratic medieval warfare were cut down in repeated waves. The Battle of Crécy was a disaster for France. For England, it was a spectacular victory. It showed that disciplined infantry and archers could defeat the traditional mounted knight. After Crécy, Edward III moved to capture the port city of Calais. Calais fell in 1347 and became one of England's most important bases on the continent. It gave England a doorway into France, and it would remain under English control for more than 2 centuries. But then, Europe was struck by something even deadlier than war. In 1348, the Black Death reached England and France. The plague killed millions across Europe. Entire villages were emptied. Labor became scarce. Economies were shaken. Religious and social life were deeply disturbed. For a time, the war slowed. But it did not end. In the 1350s, Edward III's son, Edward the Black Prince, led devastating campaigns through France. Like his father, he used speed, discipline, and destruction. In 1356, near the city of Poitiers, the Black Prince faced a much larger French army led by King John II of France. Once again, the French had the advantage in numbers. Once again, they attacked the English position. And once again, English defensive tactics and longbowmen proved deadly. The result was another humiliating defeat for France. But this time, the consequences were even greater. The French king himself was captured. John II, King of France, became a prisoner of the English. This was a political earthquake. France was thrown into crisis. The monarchy was weakened. Paris became unstable. Noble factions struggled for influence. Peasant uprisings erupted in the countryside. England seemed closer than ever to victory. In 1360, the Treaty of Bretigny was signed. Edward III gave up his claim to the French throne in exchange for large territories in France and a huge ransom for the captured French king. For a moment, it looked as if England had won. But the 100 Years' War was not over. France had been wounded, but not destroyed. The French recovery came under King Charles V. Unlike earlier French leaders, Charles V avoided the kind of large, reckless battles that had brought disaster at Crécy and Poitiers. Instead, he chose patience. He rebuilt royal authority. He strengthened administration. He used skilled commanders, especially Bertrand du Guesclin. And he slowly took back English-held lands. The French strategy changed. Rather than charging into English defensive positions, they used smaller campaigns, sieges, diplomacy, and local pressure. This was less dramatic than Crécy or Poitiers. But it worked. By the late 14th century, many of England's earlier gains had been reversed. England still held important territories, but the dream of total victory was slipping away. Then both kingdoms entered a period of internal weakness. In England, political tensions grew. In France, the situation became even more dangerous. The French King Charles VI suffered from severe mental illness. As his ability to rule declined, powerful noble factions fought for control of the kingdom. France was divided between rival factions, especially the Armagnacs and the Burgundians. This internal conflict gave England a new opportunity, and in 1415, a young English king decided to take it. His name was Henry V. Henry V was ambitious, disciplined, and determined to revive the English claim in France. In 1415, he invaded Normandy and captured the town of Harfleur. But the siege was costly. Henry's army was weakened by disease, hunger, and exhaustion. Instead of continuing a major campaign, he decided to march north toward Calais. But the French blocked his path near a place called Agincourt. The English army was tired. It was outnumbered. It was deep in enemy territory. The French nobility expected victory. But the battlefield favored the English. Heavy rain had turned the ground into mud. The field was narrow, trapped between woods. French knights in heavy armor had to advance through thick, wet earth under a storm of English arrows. As they moved forward, the French lines became compressed. Men stumbled. Horses panicked. Knights fell and could not rise. Those behind pushed forward, crushing the men in front. The English archers, protected by stakes, fired until the French attack lost momentum. Then English men-at-arms and archers joined the close fighting. Agincourt became one of the most famous victories in English history. For France, it was another catastrophe. But Agincourt was not only important because of the battle itself. Henry V used the victory to conquer more territory. In the following years, he took much of Normandy. In 1420, the Treaty of Troyes recognized Henry as heir to the French throne and arranged his marriage to Catherine of Valois, the daughter of the French king. It seemed possible that England and France might be united under one crown. But then history turned again. Henry V died in 1422. Only weeks later, Charles VI of France also died. Henry's infant son, Henry VI, was declared king of both England and France by the English side. But many French people supported another claimant, Charles VII, the son of Charles VI. France was divided. The English controlled much of the north. The powerful Duke of Burgundy was allied with England. The French cause seemed weak. And then, from a small village in northeastern France, a teenage girl entered history. Her name was Joan of Arc. She was not a noble. She was not a trained soldier. She was not a political leader. She was a peasant girl who claimed that divine voices had told her to help Charles VII and save France from the English. At first, this seemed impossible, but France was desperate. Joan was brought to Charles VII. Somehow, she convinced him and his supporters that she had a mission. Wearing armor and carrying a banner, she joined the French forces during the siege of Orleans in 1429. Orleans was crucial. If the city fell, the English could push deeper into southern France. Charles VI's cause might collapse completely. But Joan's arrival changed morale. The French attacked. The English siege was broken. The relief of Orleans became one of the great turning points of the war. Soon after, Charles VII was crowned at Reims, the traditional coronation city of French kings. This mattered enormously. He was no longer just a claimant hiding behind weak support. He was now a consecrated king. Joan had helped transform a struggling prince into the legitimate king of France. But her own fate was tragic. In 1430, she was captured by Burgundian forces and handed over to the English. She was put on trial, accused of heresy, and burned at the stake in 1431. She was about 19 years old. The English hoped her death would damage French morale. Instead, her legend grew. Joan of Arc became a symbol of resistance, faith, and French unity. And after her death, the French recovery continued. The alliance between England and Burgundy eventually collapsed. The French crown became stronger. French armies became more organized. Artillery became more important. The balance of the war had changed. England was no longer trying to conquer France. It was trying to hold on. The 100 Years' War was not only a struggle between kings. It was also a transformation in the way wars were fought. At the beginning of the conflict, the battlefield was still dominated by the ideals of chivalry. Noble knights, armored cavalry, personal honor, ransom, and aristocratic courage were central to medieval warfare. But the war exposed the limits of that world. At Crécy, Poitiers, and Agincourt, French knights suffered terrible defeats against disciplined English defensive positions and longbowmen. The longbow did not end chivalry by itself, but it showed that training, terrain, discipline, and tactics could defeat noble cavalry. War was also becoming more expensive and more organized. Kings needed taxation, supply systems, contracts, ships, garrisons, siege equipment, and professional soldiers. Armies could not simply live on glory. They needed food, money, arrows, horses, wagons, armor, and political support. By the 15th century, another force was becoming more important: gunpowder artillery. Cannons changed siege warfare. Castles and fortified towns, once extremely difficult to take, became more vulnerable to bombardment. The French made better use of artillery in the final phase of the war, and this helped them push the English back, region by region. The medieval battlefield was changing. The age of the knight was not instantly over, but it was no longer the same. By the 1440s and 1450s, France had rebuilt its strength. The French monarchy was more centralized. Its armies were more professional. Its artillery was more effective. And English power in France was weakening. The French reconquered Normandy. Then they turned toward Gascony, the old heart of English power in southwestern France. In 1453, the decisive moment came at the Battle of Castillon. The English army was defeated by French forces using strong defensive positions and artillery. Castillon effectively ended the 100 Years' War. England lost almost all of its lands in France. Only Calais remained in English hands. France emerged stronger, more united, and more centralized. England returned home weakened, frustrated, and politically unstable. Soon, England would fall into its own internal conflict, the Wars of the Roses. So who won the 100 Years' War? The simple answer is France. But the deeper answer is that both kingdoms were transformed. The war helped shape stronger ideas of English and French identity. It weakened the older feudal order. It showed that knights and castles were no longer enough. Infantry, archers, artillery, taxation, administration, and centralized monarchy were becoming the future of war. And the year the war ended was also symbolic for another reason. In 1453, far to the east, Constantinople fell to Sultan Mehmed II and the Ottoman Empire. In the west, France pushed England out of its lands. In the east, the Byzantine Empire came to an end. Across Europe and the Mediterranean, the medieval world was changing. Not in a single day, not in one battle, but in 1453, it became impossible to ignore. The 100 Years' War began as a dynastic dispute between kings. But it became much more than that. It was a war for land, a war for legitimacy, a war for survival, and eventually, a war that helped create a new political world. At the beginning, England seemed capable of breaking France. Its kings won stunning victories. Its archers humbled French knights. Its armies captured kings, cities, and provinces. But France endured. It adapted. It reorganized. It found new symbols, new leaders, and new methods of war. By the end, England's dream of ruling France was dead. France had survived and emerged stronger. The 100 Years' War did not simply end the Middle Ages, but it revealed that the medieval world was already changing. The knight was giving way to the soldier. The castle was giving way to the cannon. The feudal lord was giving way to the centralized state. And old dynastic claims were giving way to something closer to national identity. This was the 100 Years' War, a conflict that lasted more than a century, a war that began with a crown and ended by changing Europe forever.